Greetings and welcome to an online edition of History 1302. For those of you that have been following along closely in our class, you know that we've been talking about the expansion and the development of the American economy. And you also know that while this economy was tremendously beneficial for a handful of Americans, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts of the world, by and large, it at the very least complicated things for many Americans, and in a lot of ways destroyed freedom, destroyed equality for many more Americans. Certainly an example that we can point to is the main character of our book, Jurgis Rudkis. So, at any rate, by the turn of the 20th century, in other words, in the 1890s, the early 1900s, there were a lot of people that were trying to make some order, some sense out of this world that was emerging. And one of the very popular doctrines, so to speak, when it comes to explaining why there was fantastically rich standing next to grinding poverty, was the theory of social Darwinism. Now, we've talked about this to some extent in the class, and we understand that Charles Darwin's theories on evolution, how plants and animals are constantly adapting to best fit in with their surroundings and their environment. There's a lot of people that are applying that to the society that they're seeing emerge in the Gilded Age. But this social Darwinist theory was giving a scientific, or at least a pseudo-scientific explanation in terms of why there was rich and why there was poor. I've asked you that question before. Do you buy this? Do you buy that Andrew Carnegie's brain was just simply better adapted to maneuver the contours of modern industry, whereas Jurgis Rudkis had not evolved, and therefore that's why he's poor. That's why he has to go through so many difficult trials. The fact of the matter was, most of us agreed that there are other extenuating circumstances: ethnic, racial biases, sexism, class biases, things that were stacking the cards against Americans like Jurgis Rudkis. Well, simultaneously, there were other groups of Americans, pockets of Americans, that began to rebel against this status quo. One of those groups were primarily from Indiana, but throughout the Midwest, and referred to themselves as the Mugwumps. And the Mugwumps were really resentful of these political machines that had begun to emerge in the cities. Now keep in mind, in the cities, what you're seeing happening here is this political machine, the trade of your vote for a political favor, and ultimately what that's doing is it's corrupting the process that is politics. Well, the other thing that it's doing, all this immigration into New York and Chicago and Boston and San Francisco and whatnot, it's also making the countryside pretty much insignificant, irrelevant. It doesn't matter, what you vote in Terre Haute, Indiana. The fact of the matter is, if Chicago doesn't like it, it's going to get knocked down. The Mugwumps particularly resented these political machines because of the corruption. And one way that they felt that they could clean up this corruption was by an implementation of a secret ballot. Now, those of you that have voted, think back to the time that you voted. It's a very private affair. You stood in line, and then you handed somebody your identification or your voter registration card, and then they took you over to a little booth where it had blinders on each side, and nobody could see what you were doing or how you were voting or whatnot. This would have been completely opposite to Americans in the late 19th century who voted very publicly. I mean, all that would happen is there would be a polling place, and everybody that was a Republican would walk to one side of the room, and everybody that was a Democrat would walk to the other side of the room, and therefore, if you came from a long line of Republicans and you started to gravitate toward the Democratic side of the room, there could be some pressure that was put on you. The Mugwumps wanted to clean up that pressure, and they felt by implementing the secret ballot that would alleviate individuals from feeling that pressure to walk one way or another, and it would purify the process of voting. But think about this. One thing that you absolutely must be able to do if this secret ballot is going to work, you must be able to read. Jurgis Rudkis is not a native-born English speaker. He's also not a particularly well-educated individual. So what's going to happen to Jurgis Rudkis's ability to vote if this secret ballot is implemented? Well, the bottom line is voter turnout declines rapidly after 1892. After 1892, America implements what comes to be known as the Australian secret ballot, and it requires people to be able to read and decipher their ballot in order to participate in the democratic process. So the consequence, what the mugwumps were trying to do, actually ended up disfranchising individuals in the process, taking their votes away. Another group that I'd like us to be mindful of, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The WCTU was the current version of a long line of organizations, primarily women's organizations, within what comes to be known as the temperance, ban alcohol movement. Now, part of what Frances Willard, the leader of the WCTU, was talking about was protecting the home. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about a time period that emphasizes that women should be in the home. So the idea of getting the government to ban the consumption or sale of alcoholic beverages is a very public thing to do. So in ways, what the WCTU is doing is it's bucking the system of the cult of true womanhood, but at the same time, it's using an aspect of the cult. In other words, the protection of the home, and that would be woman's responsibility, to be able to justify why they're speaking out in public. Now, look, my point in all of this is actually relatively simple. What you're beginning to see is a rebellion from the status quo. Whether you're talking about the mugwumps or whether you're talking about the temperance union, whatever the case may be, people are beginning to see holes in the system, the political system, the economic system, what have you, throughout the Gilded Age. Now, the really important institution or event that I want us to kind of realize with respect to this rebellion is the emergence of what historians call the populist movement. Now, the populist movement was political in its orientation, and we had a monopoly, and to some extent still have this political monopoly, the Republicans and the Democrats. The Republicans claimed to represent one political orientation, whereas the Democrats offer another orientation. But the more and more you study politics, the more and more you realize that they're basically the same thing. The differences are minute in the grand scheme of things. Well, one of the groups that began to realize that it's the same thing, just different colors or different symbols, different badges, was farmers. Now, I need you to understand, throughout the 1880s and the 1890s, the farmers had really been hurting. They had been price gouged by the railroads. There was one railroad that ran through Nowhereville, South Dakota, and so therefore if you wanted to get your wheat to market, you didn't have a choice. You had to pay the freight, even though it was exorbitantly priced, or your family starved. They were price gouged by the bankers that charged exorbitant interest rates on the loans that they had to take. So the one thing that the farmers could use in America is a little bit of assistance from the government. They could use some protection. They could use some financial reform to tell the banks and Wall Street that they could not do this. Problem was, Wall Street was controlling the Republican Party and were controlling the Democratic Party as well. What we see emerge in the late 1880s and the early 1890s is something called the Farmers' Alliance, and I want you to be very direct in your understanding of this Farmers' Alliance. What this is an organization for farmers at the local economic level. A lot of farmers began asking the question, what if when you needed a loan you didn't have to go to the fat cat banker from New York? What if you went to a collection of other farmers like yourself? They would be sure not to do you dirty. They would be sure to give you a fair interest rate, and they would be sure to give you a fair amount of time to pay it back. What if when you had to ship your wheat, your corn, whatever it is that you're shipping to market, you didn't have to use the New York Central Railroad. You used a railroad that was owned and operated for and by farmers. My point is, they start to form these economic cooperatives. They begin to pool their resources. Well, all of this is fine and well, but they're only up against massive, massive corporate conglomerations headed up by people like Cornelius Vanderbilt or investment banker J.P. Morgan. And so the point is, the big powers that be, they don't like to see this because it really is treading on what they see to be their territory. So the bottom line is this: the Farmers Alliance fails. It fails because it's not well funded enough. It's a nice idea, but the fact of the matter is, until you get some serious money that can actually compete with the J.P. Morgans of the world, there's not really much that the farmers can do to counteract this exploitation. What did survive, however, was the notion that something needed to change politically. If the Democrats or the Republicans were not going to do anything to address the plight of the farmer, then what we would need is an emergence of a third party. And that's exactly what we see happen in 1892, with the emergence of what comes to be known as the Populist Party. Okay? Now, for your notes, the Populist Party grew out of the ashes of the Farmers Alliance. It grew out of the frustration that people said, this Farmers Alliance is a mechanism that'll do everything except for what we need it to do, which is actually clean up the political process and regulate the American economy. So in 1892, we see the emergence of a challenge to the two-party system, and that's the Populist Party. They run a guy by the name of James B. Weaver, and he runs on this very working-class platform. I don't necessarily mean that in the sense that people working in the factory. I just mean people that are producing with their hands, and certainly the farmers would qualify as such. But I want you to understand a little bit about the platform of the Populist Party. This is an organization that wanted the government to own the railroads. Now, they wanted the railroads to be nationalized because they looked around and they said, is there a fair railroad company out there? Can you name one railroad company that wouldn't rob you blind if you gave it half a chance? And pretty much everybody said, no, we can't name that railroad. They wanted more regulations of the banks, and to that end, they wanted the federal government to put more money out in the economy. They wanted more people to be spending more money, and one of the only ways to do that is to put more money in more people's hands and make money, the supply of it anyway, much more readily available. They wanted the nationalization of the communication networks, which would mean that the government would operate the telegraph system, later on the telephone system. There would be no such thing as the corporation that would eventually be known as AT&T. Okay? But the really big issue that the populists wanted to see implemented was the progressive income tax. Now, some of you may have a background with respect to the progressive income tax. It's really simple, actually. The way that this works is the more that you earn, the more that you pay in the form of taxes. So you have somebody like Andrew Carnegie that earns millions and millions of dollars every year. He would pay considerably more than somebody like Jurgis Rudkis, who not only earns much less, but basically has to spend every cent of that money if he's going to survive. And that's probably not him making ends meet at the end of the month anyway. So the progressive income tax was seen as a leveling playing field. I mean, the Andrew Carnegies of the world had more money than they could spend in 20 different lifetimes, and therefore they were able to pretty much buy and sell politicians at will. If, theoretically, it is a theory, if the government were to tax them more, not only would that level out the playing field to the point where average Americans could compete on a somewhat equal footing, it would also generate more revenue for the federal government to do things like build roads and build schools and invest in the American infrastructure. Okay? It is a theory, but it's a theory that caught on very, very well with the target group that the populists were going after, primarily farmers and to a lesser extent workers. Now, if you know anything about American politics, you know that third parties don't tend to do particularly well. They're lucky, like for example in 2000, Ralph Nader was doing backflips because the Green Party won a whopping 9% of the popular vote. Well, what that meant was Ralph Nader and the Green Party basically had their teeth handed to them by both the Republicans and the Democrats. But they were ecstatic that 9% of the American voting public actually cast their ballot for the Green Party. In 1892, the Progressive Party not only does very well in terms of a popular vote, they actually take 4 states in the Electoral College. Now, obviously, they lose the election, but this is a very significant development. And if you are a progressive party politician and or voter, you feel pretty good about 1896. Because if you can get your brand out there a little bit better, if you can get your messaging out there a little bit better, the future looks very, very bright for you. So 1896 rolls around, and the populists feel pretty good about their prospects of getting at least a few of their people into Washington, possibly even their guy into the White House. The problem, William Jennings Bryan. Now, Bryan really was sort of like the Barack Obama of his time. He came out of nowhere. He gave this just blistering speech at the 1896 Democratic National Convention, very similar to Obama in 2004. And what he talked about was a need to level the playing field, a need to regulate the American economy so that it worked for everybody, not just the billionaire class, and most importantly, the idea that there needed to be some form of social safety net with respect to people like the farmers. Well, I mean, do the math with me here, guys. What this sounds like is something quacking like a duck. It looks like something walking like a duck. It sounds an awful like a duck, and therefore a lot of people said, well, if it's what it sounds like, then it must be what it is. He's on the floor of the Democratic National Convention saying all this, and therefore a lot of people just basically go ahead and say that the Democratic Party is now becoming the party of the farmers. Well, the populists had basically made the farmers their main target group, and when William Jennings Bryan started talking about this at the Democratic National Convention, many people that had voted populist in 1892 went out there and cast their ballots for the Democrats in 1896. Here's my point. In 1896, the Populist Party was absorbed by, was fused to the Democratic Party. It's something that has happened before then, and it's something that has happened in the aftermath of this. For instance, if you were to look at the Tea Party movement in 2010, or 2009, 2010, generally this gets absorbed into the Republican Party in 2011, 2012, and beyond. So it's nothing new and it's nothing old, but what I do need you to understand is nothing changes. That's the big problem. The Democrats talk a good game with respect to the farmers, but it's not as if they're as direct and as deliberate as the populists were. Okay. Now, an even bigger problem is William McKinley. McKinley is the Republican presidential candidate for the Republican Party, and he is also very much a laissez-faire politician. He's a guy that says, if I'm elected, I will do my best to stay out of the economy, because I feel that when the government gets involved in the economy, that's when the economy does its poorest. So, obviously, both Bryan and McKinley catch the attention of people like Rockefeller and people like Carnegie. In 1896, they saw William Jennings Bryan and his warm attitude toward things like a progressive income tax or the regulation of various industries as a direct threat. So what they did is they got out their checkbook, and each of them tore out a check for about $250,000 apiece. Now, $500,000 collectively is chump change in American politics in this day and age. It really is small potatoes. But back then, this was an enormous sum of money. And just like in the 21st century, money talked in the 19th century politics. And so I probably don't need to really explain to you how or why it's McKinley that's going to win this election in 1896. 1896 rolls around, William McKinley is elected president, and a big part of that is because you saw the implementation of big money from people like Carnegie get into American politics. But the bigger significant issue is that there's not going to be any meaningful reform with respect to addressing rural poverty. The same problems that people like Jurgis Rudkis and the farmers that we were just talking about, the same problems they had, they're going to go on unaddressed into the foreseeable future. So, with that in mind, what I'd like you to do is go on to the next lecture, which will talk about the legacy of the Populist Party and ultimately how that made an impact on middle class America.